Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with my May and June wrap-up. I didn't do a wrap-up in May, mostly because I only read a couple of books. It wasn't a great reading month for me, so I just decided that I would just combine them at the end of June. I don't have most of these books anymore because they were library books for the most part. Well, actually all of them were library books, and I only have a couple of the books left still, so I'm using my handy-dandy notebook to tell me what I read because I've actually forgotten. May was a long time ago, y'all. The first book I read in May was Fast Girl by Susie Favor Hamilton. This was a memoir. She was an Olympic runner. She was very famous for scandals she was involved in and coming out as bipolar disorder and being outed as a sex worker. This memoir is a lot about her bipolar disorder. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't the most well-written book. I found it incredibly insightful into bipolar disorder and how it affected her personally. I wasn't previously very familiar with Susie Favor Hamilton. I think I'd maybe heard of her once or twice in passing, and I'd seen the SVU episode that's sort of like very loosely inspired by her. But the book itself was just a wonderful read. The next book I read in May was Salem Falls by Jodi Picoult. This was an audiobook. I'm holding up my copy, but I listened to the audiobook version of this. It was a reread for me. I gave it 3 stars. I think I probably would have given it 4 or 5 the first time I read it in high school, but to be perfectly honest, I don't love Jodi Picoult as much as I used to. Her books don't have quite the same impact. A lot of things seem for shock value. A lot of things are a little bit cringe. I didn't hate this book. Like, I obviously gave it 3 stars, and I'm going to reread more of her books, and I'll probably reread this again at some point. This was one of my favorite of her books in high school, and now I just gave it 3 stars, and I really don't know what to say. I don't know how much of that 3-star rating is nostalgia. There's a lot of cringe, but it was very interesting to read it again, knowing the ending, because this has a very twist ending that you really don't see coming, but there are a lot of hints throughout the book at it, so it was a worthwhile reread, or re-listen. I am very glad I picked it up, even if it was only 3 stars. The next book I read was One Moment, One Morning by Sarah Rayner. I did a full review on this. I gave it 3 stars. It was a women's fiction about 3 women who are changed one morning on a train when one of the woman's husband dies, and it's about that woman, her best friend, and then a random stranger that they meet on the train. And it's sort of about their friendship and their lives and how they all deal with the grief of that. I wanted to like this book more than I did. I only wound up giving it 3 stars. It was fine, somewhat generic. I wasn't the biggest fan of the writing style or of the first-person present tense. But I do think if you're looking for a pretty standard women's fiction novel dealing with grief, that this is a pretty good one to read. Next, I read The Nazi Officer's Wife by Edith Hahnbier. This was another memoir written by a Jewish woman who was a young adult during the Holocaust. She managed to escape the concentration camps by taking the papers of a Christian friend she had and pretending to be her. And as she lived during the 40s, she eventually met a Nazi officer. They dated and then wound up getting married and having a daughter together. And it's sort of just about her life during that time period. And it was really very interesting. I gave this 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it to people who are interested in reading about Nazi Germany. Because the books most people read, the memoirs or the nonfiction, you get Anne Frank's diary, which is a lot about the Jews who hid. And then you have Elie Wiesel's Night, which gives you a lot of insight into the concentration camps themselves. But there isn't a lot of talking about the Jews who didn't go to the concentration camps and weren't necessarily just hiding in a room the entire time. There were other ways of hiding during the war, and a lot of her friends were like that. They didn't go to the camps. They weren't necessarily just hiding in a locked room, pretending they weren't there. There was that middle ground of they went out in public, they had lives, they had stolen papers, and it was really interesting, really fascinating, and surprisingly well written. I thoroughly enjoyed that book and would highly, highly recommend it. Next, I read Fractured by Kate Watterson. This I gave 2 stars. It was terrible. It was so terrible. I did a rant review on it. I couldn't even contain my emotions just to give it a solid review. It was just straight ranting. I don't really know what to say. Fractured was just bad. It was a thriller. It wasn't thrilling. Oh, the whole mental illness. Crazy people are the ones who do all the killing, right? That's how that works. I hate that trope. It's the worst trope. I mean, okay, it's not the worst trope, but like, it's up there. It's so irritating. Like, it's so easy to not do it. It was just a bad book all around. Not just for that reason, but like, I gave it 2 stars. That was probably fairly generous of me, and I really don't want to dwell on it. It was forgettable too. Like, I'm sitting here trying to remember things about it to say, and like, I really should have read my notes on this book, or any of these books, before doing this wrap-up, but you know. And next I read The Imposter Bride by Nancy Richler. This was a 4-star read for me, and I was quite glad that it wasn't as terrible as Fractured, but I think Fractured was the worst book I read of the past 2 months. But The Imposter Bride was about a Jewish woman during the Holocaust who wound up escaping to Israel and then to Canada. She had an arranged marriage with a man that she'd never met, knew nothing about, and it was for immigration purposes. Like, he agreed to marry her so she could get papers and come to Canada. He decides not to marry her after looking at her once, and she marries his brother, and they have a daughter, and she runs away. And the book sort of is about simultaneously her story as well as the daughter's story as she grows up, and it was a really interesting and lovely read. It dealt a lot with Jewish people after the Holocaust, like the ones who were in Europe at the time of the Holocaust, but also Jews who had come from Russia or who were already in Canada or who were in Israel. It was very interesting, very insightful, and I don't think it was the greatest book. I was really hoping it would be a new favorite, and it wasn't, but that was disappointing only in that my expectations were too high. But I did give it 4 stars, and I found it thoroughly enjoyable and would highly recommend. And then I read The 10th Circle by Jodi Picoult. This was another where I actually listened to the audiobook, but I have a copy of this book because I have most of Jodi Picoult's books. I, again, gave this 3 stars, and this was one of my favorites when I read it back in high school originally, so it was kind of a disappointment, but honestly, I expect that with Jodi Picoult books now. They're just not... Some of them are still very good, and I still really enjoy them, but a lot of them are just like, they're fun, mediocre, generic reads for me. Entertaining, but not really much more, and this was kind of that. There was a lot of cringe going on with Trixie's rape, and the way rape was discussed, which I didn't really enjoy a lot of the discussion on that. There were a lot of characters who were saying things like, well, his life is ruined because he raped her, but like, Sheila's ruined, like, her whole life is ruined. He destroyed her life, he destroyed her, and like, that's all very like, he didn't. Like, rape is a horrible, traumatic experience, but it doesn't destroy your life. Like, your life doesn't stop. That made me very uncomfortable, and there were other things in this book I didn't like, and the way rape was discussed, and the way rape was defined, and I don't know. It was still very entertaining. Another thing is I don't recommend listening to the audiobook for this, because within the book, the main character, Daniel, is a comic book artist, and he is currently in the process of drawing a graphic novel that's sort of inspired by Dante's Inferno, and within the physical book, there are actually, like, panels from the book that he's drawing. They're not necessary for the story. I really do think they added to the story, and not having them was sort of like a disappointment because I knew they were there, and they're very interesting to read because the comic book dovetails a lot with his life. I didn't talk about the plot of this or Salem Falls at all. Salem Falls is about a man who's just been released from prison for statutory rape. He moves to a new small town. Several teenage girls accuse him of rape. It's sort of like dovetailing with the Salem witch trials, which is why it's called Salem Falls. And this is about a teenage girl who accuses her boyfriend of rape, or accuses her ex-boyfriend of rape. It's about, like, her father, who has the past in Alaska, and her mother, who's a professor and teaches Dante's Inferno, and it's a very interesting plot. Most of Jodi Picoult's books are, but just, like, emotionally, and the things she says, I really couldn't rate this higher than 3 stars. Next, I read Missing Presumed by Susie Steiner. I also gave this 2 stars. This was an adult thriller about a very wealthy, well-connected young woman. She's about 24, in grad school, who disappears without a trace. And the cops are just sort of there, investigating leads and trying to figure out what happened. I gave this 2 stars mostly because I found it very boring. I guessed what had happened very early on, well before you were supposed to, like, see it as a possibility. I was fairly certain. None of the characters were very interesting. They did a lot of cringe things. It's an adult thriller, but there was this really uncomfortable insta-love between the main character and this random dude she met and went on one date with, and then was talking about how he was the one, and about moving in with him like a few days after they met, and that was uncomfortable, and the timeline was like wonky. They'd like skip several weeks at a time. It was very annoying and very cringe, and just, I didn't like it. Mostly it was just boring. So I gave it 2 stars, and that bad luck continued with Little Girl Gone by Jerry Schmidt. I have a review for this book coming out on Thursday. This I gave 2 stars, and this was bad. This is a cop mystery thriller about an infant who's been kidnapped and the babysitter's been assaulted, but you meet the kidnappers before you meet any other characters, so you know from page 1 who the kidnappers are, why they're doing it, and you're just following the cops as they investigate all the various leads. And it's like boring and not suspenseful because like they can look into, the woman who had a sexual harassment suit against the father of the infant all they want, but she's still not going to have anything to do with it, and we know it because we witnessed the kidnapping in the 2nd chapter. Like, I gave it 2 stars, and it was just really bad, really disappointing, and this is burning me out on thrillers, guys. And the final book I read was Before I Go to Sleep by S.J. Watson. This is a book about a woman with amnesia who is trying to like work on her amnesia and remember more, and she lives with her husband. There are secrets being kept, and she doesn't know who's lying or why they're lying, and she doesn't trust anybody, and it's really like, it's incredibly suspenseful, and I honestly really enjoyed it. I gave it 3 stars and would highly recommend it as a thriller. I didn't rate it higher because I find books with amnesia to be fairly repetitive and boring. It's just not something that I enjoy reading about. Like, by nature, things have to be repeated because the character can't remember them. And that's for any amnesia story, whether it's a book or a movie or a TV show. That's just the nature of writing about amnesia, and I really don't like it. I avoid it. I probably wouldn't have picked this up if I'd known that was what the plot was going to be, but I did really enjoy her writing and her characters, so I gave it 3 stars and would recommend if you enjoy books about amnesia. And I'm honestly more excited for the 2nd book of hers I'm reading than this one, because I have a feeling that that could be potentially really good. I have reviews for most of these books. A lot of these books already posted on my channel are going to be posted because I do an individual review for every book that I read a physical copy of. So feel free to check those out if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts, because this was just kind of a general overview. I think that was 10 books. I forgot to count. But that was about 10 books over the past 2 months, which is less than I would like to be reading, but not terrible. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, if you agree with my thoughts on them, and let me know down below what your favorite book of the last 2 months was. I absolutely adore to hear what you guys have been reading. Bye!